Bruno Sammartino passed away today. The wrestling world has lost its living legend. Bruno was 82 years old. He passed away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he's lived since the 1950s, in which he moved to Pittsburgh from Italy during World War II. Not only does he have a storied career, he also has a very storied life. Having seen the experiences he had during the World Wars, the Second World War in Italy, and going on to living in the United States, not knowing any English, living in Pittsburgh, which was just a steel city back then, and going on to become one of the most important and most celebrated figures in the history of the professional wrestling business is an absolutely incredible story that needs to be made into a movie all about this man's life. He lived a full life. He was 82. We don't know the cause of death yet, but he was at that age. And unfortunately, the problem, the thing I think so many people are going to have trouble with seeing is, Bruno looks so healthy for 82 years old. I mean, I saw him talking at the Hall of Fame just 5 years ago when he was inducted, and he's appeared at the Hall of Fame, virtually all of them. Since then, I'm not so sure if he appeared this past one in New Orleans, but I remember him inducting Larry Zbyszko into the Hall of Fame, and Bruno always looked in great shape. You would never think this man's in his 80s or close to being 80 at the time. He was an 82-year-old who looked 70, and unfortunately, he passed away today. Bruno was known for having the longest world championship run in the history of the WWE. He was champion for 8 years. He won the title on May 17th, 1963, when he beat Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. Then he lost it on January 18th, 1971 to Ivan Koloff. So that was an 8-year reign. Obviously, the business was completely different then than it is now. You'll never see an 8-year reign. What he was able to accomplish, but that is still absolutely astonishing. Even in the 60s, to have an 8-year reign was incredible. And of course, we all know what Bruno was. The one building that always will be synonymous with Bruno Sammartino is Madison Square Garden. Completely, almost always selling out the Garden in the 60s, in the 70s, and then of course he had a second title reign, which was a 4-year reign, which was in 1973 and it ended in 1977. So, one of the most, the greatest wrestlers in the history of the company. Obviously, his era was totally different than this era, but he was obviously a massive draw. He was the man. He was one of the most important figures to the history of the WWE, or the WWWF at the time. Meant so much to that company. And obviously what we all know is in the 80s, he didn't like the direction of the company, and especially he really resented the company in the 90s, and he obviously did not care much for Vince McMahon, the one we know. He did not a fan of how the business was going, and he was obviously a major critic of Vince, and of course they had a falling out for many years, and Bruno was always very outspoken. And every year, the company wanted him to go into the Hall of Fame because there was no more deserving man. He was a massive draw. I mean, he was, depends on how you look, as the biggest draw, but, I think when you adjust the inflation for what the cost, then he's probably the biggest draw in the history of the company. And eventually, in 2013, he went into the Hall of Fame. And someone we have to thank most for that is Triple H. Triple H always wanted Bruno into the Hall of Fame, and he even flew to Pittsburgh to Bruno's house to convince him to go to the Hall of Fame. It took many years, and Triple H, he deserves a lot of credit. He tweeted, obviously, that he was devastated by the news. I'm sure he is, He had that close relationship with Bruno, and, brought him finally got him in the Hall of Fame. It's just really unfortunate that, it's one of those things, like 82 years old, full life. He lived a great life, an incredible life. But, it's sad to see such an important figure is no longer with us. And of course, like, as fans, we don't know Bruno Sammartino, but we know how much he meant to wrestling, and him not being here is really sad. We can keep talking about his career. when he went to the Hall of Fame in the Garden, I just thought it was incredible. Finally, after all these years, he's in the Hall of Fame. There's never been a more deserving candidate. And of course, it wasn't the WWE keeping him out of the Hall of Fame, but he didn't want to go in for a while. And I remember he would always do interviews on Wrestling Observer Radio with Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez, and he was just really, very outspoken man, but just a very wise man. It's such a great ambassador for wrestling. The man, I would say without question the greatest ambassador for wrestling. There's not one bad thing I think you can say about him, that he doesn't have one bad thing on his record. He lived such a great life, and I would say the greatest figure in the history of wrestling. When you look at, there's not a bad thing anyone has to say about him in the sense of just the way he conducted himself. He was a man's man. Sammartino, I mean, I wouldn't, it's hard to rank him because his era was so different than everyone else's, but no one can deny one of the most important and one of the biggest stars in the history of the company. His era, younger fans like me who were born in the 90s, obviously we never saw Sammartino wrestle, but of the legend of Bruno Sammartino, and that shows his legacy. And Pittsburgh, the city he was in, the mayor of Pittsburgh talked about this. He called Bruno the greatest ambassador in the history of Pittsburgh, and that tells you a lot about this man's character, what the greatest character in the history of wrestling. I'm not talking about a storyline character. I'm talking his character as a man. The city of Pittsburgh, all paying tribute to him. The Pittsburgh Steelers are paying tribute to him on their Twitter. He was an icon in Pittsburgh, a Pittsburgh icon. Such a legend. They called him the living legend for a while. It's April 18th, 2018. It's a today that if you're a wrestling fan, you're going to remember in infamy, because this is when the living legend passed away, 82 years old. Obviously, everyone gives, I'm sure I speak for everyone who's a fan of pro wrestling, we all give our deepest condolences to Sammartino's family, and we say goodbye to the living legend, and we say goodbye to Bruno. And I'm sure the WWE, they did a 10-bell salute. They were overseas today, but I'm sure when they get to Monday Night Raw and SmackDown, they'll do 2 great tributes for Bruno. Very unfortunate. And the living legend has passed away, but he will always be the living legend. And he will be forever missed in the city of Pittsburgh. And to his family, of course, who, again, we send our deepest condolences, and he will always be revered. You will never hear a bad thing about this man. This man will always be revered in the history of professional wrestling. The greatest figure in the history of wrestling, the greatest ambassador the wrestling world can ever imagine. And unfortunately, he's passed away, but his legacy will live forever, and he will always be the living legend.